At first glance, Brazil does not look like a country struggling to become powerful. It looks like the kind of place ancient civilizations would have worshipped. The camera rises slowly above the Amazon rainforest at dawn. Clouds drift over endless, green-like smoke floating across another planet. Rivers twist through the jungle with such scale they resemble inland oceans. Somewhere beneath the trees lie rare minerals, untapped resources, and hidden reserves powerful enough to feed modern industry for generations. Far to the south, São Paulo awakens beneath a haze of helicopter blades and neon lights. Cargo ships gather silently along Atlantic ports. Iron ore trains cut across the landscape like mechanical arteries carrying pieces of the earth itself. Toward foreign markets, endless soybean fields stretch beyond the horizon. Offshore oil platforms glow against black ocean water like floating cities. Everything about Brazil feels enormous. The land is enormous. The population is enormous. The natural wealth is enormous. And yet, the power never fully arrived. That is, the mystery? For decades, economists, investors, and geopolitical strategists repeated the same prediction with almost religious certainty. Brazil was destined to become one of the great superpowers of the modern age. How could it not? It possesses more fresh water than almost any nation on Earth. It controls enormous agricultural capacity capable of feeding hundreds of millions. It contains iron or gold, lithium, oil, timber, hydroelectric potential, and biodiversity, so vast scientists still do not fully understand it. From above, Brazil looks less like a nation and more like a sleeping continent. And perhaps that is why its story feels so unsettling, because civilizations throughout history fought wars over resources like these. Empires expanded across oceans, searching for wealth hidden beneath foreign soil. Kingdoms collapsed because they lacked what Brazil already possesses naturally. Yet somehow, the nation repeatedly approached greatness without fully reaching it. There is an old phrase often repeated about Brazil, sometimes as a compliment, sometimes as a joke, and sometimes with quiet exhaustion. Brazil is the country of the future, and always will be. The sentence sounds hopeful at first, then disturbing, because hidden inside those words is the feeling of a promise endlessly delayed, a future permanently arriving, but never becoming reality. And in the early 2000s, it finally seemed as though the prophecy was about to come true. The world changed suddenly. China industrialized at historic speed. Factories expanded endlessly. Entire cities emerged almost overnight. Global demand for commodities exploded. Iron ore, soybeans, beef, oil, sugar, and minerals became the fuel of globalization itself. Brazil stood directly in the center of this transformation. Foreign investors flooded into the country, searching for growth. Commodity prices soared. Millions escaped poverty. Construction cranes filled skylines. New highways expanded through the interior. The Brazilian middle class grew. Rapidly, international magazines celebrated the arrival of a new global giant. Then came the symbolic moment that made the optimism feel permanent. Goldman Sachs grouped Brazil into the famous BRIC nations: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Economies predicted to dominate the future world order. Suddenly, Brazil was no longer viewed as an unstable developing country. It was treated like an emerging empire. The world began projecting destiny onto Brazil. Rio de Janeiro prepared for the Olympics. The World Cup arrived. Massive stadiums rose from the ground like monuments to confidence. Offshore oil discoveries triggered national euphoria. Politicians described the future in almost mythological terms. For a brief moment, Brazil looked like tomorrow's superpower wearing today's clothes. But beneath the celebration, something darker was growing. Prosperity built on resource booms can feel deceptively permanent. Corruption expanded quietly behind political speeches. Debt accumulated beneath consumer optimism. Entire industries became increasingly dependent on commodity exports and foreign demand. The stronger Brazil appeared externally, the more fragile certain foundations became internally. And slowly, the illusion began cracking. Scandals erupted. Markets panicked. Political chaos intensified. Growth slowed. Confidence evaporated almost as quickly as it had appeared. And once again, Brazil returned to the same haunting position it had occupied for generations: suspended somewhere between enormous potential and unfinished destiny. But this is where the story becomes larger than Brazil itself, because Brazil may not actually be an exception. In fact, it may reveal one of the deepest hidden contradictions inside the modern global economy. History contains a strange paradox. Japan became one of the most technologically advanced economies on Earth, despite possessing relatively few natural resources. South Korea industrialized into a manufacturing and technological powerhouse with limited land and almost no vast commodity empire. Singapore became a financial nerve center, despite being physically tiny. Meanwhile, countries overflowing with natural wealth often struggled with instability, corruption, dependency, inflation, debt crises, and unfinished modernization. Why? Why do nations rich in resources so often remain politically fragile? Why do countries overflowing with abundance repeatedly experience volatility, while resource-poor societies build stable industrial systems? The answer may be uncomfortable, because in the modern world, power may no longer belong to nations that merely possess wealth. It may belong to nations controlling the systems through which wealth moves: the banks, the reserve currencies, the shipping routes, the technologies, the financial institutions, the networks deciding who captures the real value of global trade. Owning resources is not the same as controlling power, and perhaps Brazil spent centuries confusing the two. Imagine two kingdoms. One survives through discipline, innovation, and efficiency because scarcity forces adaptation. The other sits atop mountains of gold so vast that extraction itself becomes easier than transformation. One builds systems because it must. The other exports treasure because it can. Over time, the first kingdom learns to control industries, finance, and technology. The second becomes dependent on selling pieces of itself into systems designed elsewhere. And slowly, the richer land becomes the weaker empire. This is the paradox hiding inside Brazil's story, because maybe Brazil was never truly failing to become a superpower. Maybe the modern global system simply rewards a different kind of power entirely. And if that is true, then Brazil is not just a country struggling with corruption or economic instability. It is a mirror reflecting how the modern world actually functions beneath the surface. But to understand why Brazil became trapped between abundance and dependency, we have to travel backward in time, back before globalization, back before oil discoveries, back before modern finance, back to the moment Brazil stopped being a land and became a machine designed to export wealth outward forever. Long before Brazil became a nation, it became an extraction machine. That distinction matters more than it first appears, because nations, built to create wealth internally, often develop institutions, industries, and systems designed for long-term sovereignty. But territories designed primarily for extraction evolve differently. Their roads point outward. Their ports face foreign markets. Their economies revolve around exporting value rather than compounding it domestically. And from the very beginning, Brazil was shaped by this logic. When Portuguese explorers arrived on the Brazilian coast in the 1500s, they did not see a future superpower waiting to emerge. They saw timber, sugar, labor, gold, and land, raw material for an expanding imperial economy. Brazil was valuable not because of what it could become, but because of what could be removed from it. The colony's destiny was tied to Europe. From the start, along the Atlantic coastline, colonial ports pulsed like arteries connecting South America to distant empires. Ships departed loaded with sugar, tobacco, brazelwood, and later, precious metals. Wealth crossed the ocean continuously, while internal development remained fragmented and fragile. Brazil functioned almost like a heart pumping resources outward, while starving its own organs, and hidden inside this structure was the beginning of a paradox that would repeat for centuries. The more profitable extraction became, the less incentive elites often had to diversify the economy beyond. Extraction itself, sugar, was the first great engine. Plantations spread across enormous territories powered by one of the largest slave economies in human history. Millions of Africans were transported across the Atlantic into brutal labor systems, feeding Europe's hunger for wealth and luxury. Sugar transformed Brazil into a major economic center of the Portuguese Empire. But prosperity built on extraction creates strange distortions. enormous wealth concentrated into the hands of plantation elites, while broader institutional development lagged behind. Infrastructure existed primarily to move commodities efficiently toward ports. Society became deeply unequal, woven directly into the architecture of Brazilian history. Then came gold. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, massive discoveries in Minas Gerais triggered one of the greatest gold rushes the world had ever seen. Entire towns appeared almost overnight deep inside the Brazilian interior. European merchants flooded into the region. Fortunes emerged with astonishing speed. For Portugal, Brazilian gold became a lifeline. The empire extracted immense quantities of wealth from the colony, helping finance European ambitions and trade networks. But once again, much of the value flowed outward rather than building diversified industrial foundations inside Brazil itself. Gold behaves like fire in history. It creates movement, obsession, and illusion. For a moment, societies touched by gold believe they have escaped limitation itself. But beneath the surface, dependency deepens quietly. Economies begin revolving around external demand. Political structures organize themselves around resource control. Wealth becomes concentrated and unstable. Brazil experienced this pattern repeatedly, and perhaps the strangest part is that each cycle created genuine optimism. Every boom felt like the beginning of transformation. Every era believed it had finally escaped the past. Then coffee reshaped the country in the 19th century. Coffee exports exploded globally, turning Brazil into one of the world's dominant suppliers. Plantation elites accumulated enormous political influence. Entire regions became economically dependent on global commodity markets. Railways expanded aggressively across the interior. But even modernization carried hidden contradictions. British financiers invested heavily in Brazilian rail infrastructure, not necessarily to industrialize Brazil independently, but to move coffee and raw materials efficiently toward export ports. Infrastructure expanded, yet much of it reinforced the same outward-facing economic architecture established centuries earlier. This is one of history's quieter paradoxes. Foreign investment often appears developmental while simultaneously deepening dependency. The country modernizes selectively. Ports improve. Railways expand. Commodity sectors flourish. Yet industrial sovereignty remains incomplete because the system is still optimized around extraction rather than transformation. Then came rubber. In the late 19th century, the Amazon suddenly became one of the world's most valuable regions. Industrialization created massive demand for rubber used in machinery, electrical systems, bicycles, and eventually automobiles. Manaus, deep inside the rainforest, transformed almost overnight into a surreal symbol of wealth. European style. Opera houses rose beneath jungle canopies. Aristocrats imported luxury goods from Paris. Streets glowed with electric lights, while much of the world still lived in darkness. For a moment, it looked impossible that the boom could end, but resource booms are often more fragile than they appear. British agents secretly smuggled rubber seeds out of Brazil and established competing plantations in Southeast Asia. Asian production proved more efficient. Prices collapsed. The Amazon economy imploded, and the opera houses remained behind, like abandoned monuments to temporary prosperity. Again and again, Brazil experienced the same emotional rhythm: explosion, optimism, dependency, collapse. By the 20th century, political leaders became increasingly obsessed with breaking this cycle. Industrialization accelerated under nationalist economic policies. Massive infrastructure projects attempted to unify and modernize the country. Military governments promised discipline, development, and national strength. Then came Brasilia, a futuristic capital city rising from emptiness in the interior, like a science fiction vision of rebirth. Wide avenues, monumental buildings, modernist architecture. The city symbolized something psychologically important: Brazil's refusal to see itself merely as a resource colony of history. The nation wanted reinvention, and for a while, growth surged dramatically. Factories expanded, urban populations exploded, industrial output increased. Brazil seemed to move closer toward becoming the fully modern power it had long imagined itself to be. But beneath the momentum, familiar vulnerabilities remained. Debt accumulated aggressively. During periods of rapid expansion, external borrowing increased. Inflation pressures intensified. By the 1980s, Brazil entered a devastating financial crisis, alongside much of Latin America. Hyperinflation became so extreme that ordinary people rushed into supermarkets immediately after receiving paychecks because prices could rise within hours. Money itself began losing psychological meaning. Entire generations learned not to trust stability, and this may be one of the deepest invisible scars left by repeated economic crises. When societies experience boom and bust cycles across generations, long-term trust erodes. Citizens stop believing institutions will protect them. Political polarization intensifies. Short-term survival begins replacing strategic planning. Why sacrifice for the future? If the future repeatedly collapses anyway, this is why Brazil's story cannot be reduced to one corrupt leader, one failed reform, or one political ideology. The pattern is older than modern politics itself. It is structural, architectural, historical. 4 centuries, Brazil remained tied to a global system rewarding extraction while limiting transformation. And yet, despite all this history, the early 2000s suddenly created the feeling that everything had changed. China's rise triggered an unprecedented commodity boom. Foreign capital flooded into Brazil. Millions entered the middle class. Oil discoveries ignited national excitement. The world declared a new era had arrived at last. It seemed Brazil had escaped history itself, but hidden beneath the celebration, the old architecture was quietly waiting to return. There is a dangerous kind of prosperity that feels permanent while quietly weakening everything beneath it. Brazil encountered this illusion again and again at the surface level. The pattern appears simple. Commodity prices rise, exports surge. Foreign investment floods inward. Governments celebrate growth. Consumers spend confidently. Cities expand upward into skylines of steel and glass. For a few shining years, the nation feels unstoppable. But underneath the celebration, invisible structural pressures begin accumulating like stress fractures inside a dam. And by the time the cracks become visible, the cycle is already reversing. Is the hidden machinery behind many resource-rich economies. The paradox begins with abundance itself. Most societies throughout history were forced to innovate because scarcity demanded adaptation. Nations without natural resources had little choice but to build efficient institutions, industrial systems, technological capacity, and disciplined financial structures. Survival depended on transformation rather than extraction. But countries overflowing with natural wealth face a different temptation. Extraction becomes easier than transformation. Why spend decades developing advanced manufacturing, technological ecosystems, and complex industrial supply chains when the ground itself generates enormous profit? Why endure the painful discipline of long-term restructuring when global demand already rewards raw exports immediately? Easy wealth changes, incentives, and over time, entire political and economic systems begin organizing themselves around this logic. Brazil became deeply tied to commodities: iron ore, soybeans, beef oil, sugar, coffee, timber, and minerals, feeding global markets hungry for raw material. During boom periods, these exports generated extraordinary national income. Foreign currency flooded into the economy. Optimism spread rapidly, but the prosperity carried hidden side effects few people noticed in real time. As commodity exports expanded, Brazil's currency often strengthened dramatically. At first, this looked like proof of national success. Imported electronics became cheaper. Consumption increased. Middle-class lifestyles expanded. International confidence surged. Producing manufactured goods suddenly struggled to compete internationally because exports become more expensive relative to competitors. Foreign imports flood local markets. Industrial sectors weaken gradually beneath the surface, while commodity sectors dominate more and more of the economy. This phenomenon behaves almost like gravity. The economy slowly tilts toward extraction because extraction becomes the easiest source of growth. And this creates one of the most important paradoxes in modern capitalism. Countries exporting raw materials often appear wealthy, while countries controlling manufacturing, finance, technology, and intellectual property capture the highest layers of value. Brazil exports iron ore, another country transforms it into advanced machinery. Another integrates that machinery into automated industrial systems. Another controls the software powering those systems. Another finances the transactions through global banking networks. By the end of the chain, the raw material itself represents only a fraction of the final value created. The real wealth increasingly exists not in possession of resources, but in control over transformation. Modern empires rarely dominate through extraction alone. They dominate through systems. This is why resource booms can become psychologically deceptive. During periods of rising commodity prices, societies begin believing temporary external demand represents permanent national advancement. Governments spend aggressively because revenues feel endless. Politicians promise expansive social programs and infrastructure projects. Banks lend confidently. Consumers borrow enthusiastically. The future begins feeling guaranteed. But commodity economies depend heavily on forces outside their control: Chinese industrial demand, global investor sentiment, shipping costs, geopolitical tensions, energy prices, interest rates set abroad, and financial flows moving across borders at extraordinary speed. In other words, prosperity becomes externally dependent. Brazil repeatedly found itself riding waves generated elsewhere. And when those waves reversed, the consequences spread quickly across the entire economy. Factories slowed, construction halted, currency values collapsed, debt burdens intensified. Political instability surged. Optimism transformed into frustration almost overnight. This repeated emotional whiplash left psychological scars deeper than most economic statistics can capture. Because when populations experience cycles of inflation, corruption scandals, recession, and instability repeatedly across generations, institutional trust begins eroding. Citizens stop believing stability is real. Long-term planning weakens. Cynicism spreads. Political polarization intensifies because every crisis feels like proof that the system itself is fundamentally unreliable. And perhaps this is where Brazil's story becomes less economic and more human. A society shaped by recurring instability eventually adapts psychologically to uncertainty itself.